The history of the Port of Los Angeles begins with unpromising geography and evolves from the emergence of America's second-largest city. It is a timeline for more than 200 years of U.S. economic and political change, from our nation's early growth, expanding to fill a continent, through wars, booms, depressions, and dramatic social change. It's also the story of small, close-knit harbor communities and people from around the world who worked to create one of the world's most prosperous and productive economic regions. It's the story of the making of America's busiest port. By 1960, after less than 100 years, the Port of Los Angeles had gone from undeveloped mudflats to one of America's most important ports. A revolution in shipping had begun, the container age.
Matson and Sealand were really the originators of containerization. And after they came and started the containerization, then you saw ship line by ship line move into that field, and then the whole international trade changed.
It's forever changed the waterfront. After that, it's to what we have today. I can remember we had no cranes. Now what I got, 100, 200, I don't know. I stopped counting.
All that growth required millions of dollars. In the past, port projects depended on federal expenditures and voter-approved allocations. In 1959, the Harbor Department was granted the right to seek bond issues on its own, adding new revenue sources and vital financial flexibility to fund additional facilities. Now it was a race to the future.
Ships were designed and built differently. Facilities on the seaside had to be able to accommodate containers. No longer would you need finger piers. You now had to have these large pieces of container terminals with large masses of land with heavy reinforcement to hold them, with lots of lighting, with these major cranes. Who is going to buy those cranes? Who's going to own them and maintain them? What size will those vessels be? How deep will the water be? How far ahead do you plan? What's the next generation of ship to come? What will be the next ways of moving cargo in and out of this basin? What will be the implications, not just here at the port, but up and down these corridors in Southern California?
For ship owners, containerization was a good thing, faster and cheaper. But dock workers were concerned.
When they first brought the first container ship to LA Harbor, the guys all refused to work it. Said, no, we can't do this because it cut back on a lot of the total manning. Instead of putting boxes of pineapple on a pallet board and lifting it off, they could take 10 ton of pineapple in a container and lift it off at one time.
Organized worker opposition could cripple port operations. In 1960, labor leader Harry Bridges stepped in with a plan to balance mechanization and men, a concept known as M&M.
The 1960 contract understood that there was going to be a new method, and the new method was a container. And that contract was visionary on part of the union, because the union is the one that made it happen. Well, what was really traded off was a more efficient method of productivity with some job security for the people that were left.
During the 60s, a series of M&M contracts eased the port and port workers into a new era. Productivity increased to record levels. Moving swiftly, Los Angeles Harbor was soon handling more cargo than any West Coast port. The result was new jobs.
When I came on the docks, the longshoremen in Local 13, there was probably 2,500. Now there's 65 to 7,000 now.
Okay, here we go, supercargo work.
Clerking-wise, the local I belong to, 63. The clerks, we had 350. Now we have almost 1,500.
Chief Supervisor out of Singapore.
And when I first came down here, the container ships were 800, maybe 700, 800 containers on a ship, 20-foot equivalent units called TEUs. Today, we have ships at Maersk that have over 8,000 containers.
Containerization challenged old ways of keeping track of cargo and customs requirements, always the job of port clerks.
When I started, there were no computers. We did everything by hand. If there was one problem, then that would hold up clearing not only the entire vessel, but may prevent the consignee from taking delivery of their cargo. So it was a very exacting type of work.
Containerization not only changed operations in the port, it affected shipboard life, a challenge for a port chaplain.
It was a whole different community of things aboard ship that began to change in the 50s and early 60s. Ships larger, smaller crews, foreign crews who couldn't speak the language, and so all these tensions that were going on. So you only had a few minutes. I remember being engaged in a ship that had a murder aboard, and the Filipino seamen were worried. And they asked me to come and exercise the ship. And so I went aboard, we went up on the bridge, we did that, and then we have followed with the mast. And I've heard from these people saying it was one of the better journeys after that they had. They felt that it was free of whatever spirits were worrying them.
As it had been for centuries, providing supplies for ships is the job of the chandler, a task as old as seafaring, but still essential in the container age.
Basically, the word ship chandler came about, I believe, that it's from the ancient days when a chandler is a candlestick maker, a chandelier maker. And in the ancient days, lighting was pretty important. So they would consolidate everything at the chandelier makers. So say, drop it off at the chandlers. In the old days, all the ship chandlers sort of went by ethnicity. And it's a free-for-all out there for all the ship chandlers now. We don't go by ethnicity. One memorable order a long time ago, in my father's day, they were requiring a lot of garlic powder on the Japanese vessels, like 5, 10 cases. And when the ship came in, I asked him, what's all the garlic powder for? Are you sure it's not a mistake? And he says, no, we're all putting garlic powder on all our food, so it's like an aphrodisiac, and so we'll be all set to go when we get back to Japan, And that was before Viagra, of course.
Since the 1920s, oil had been a major trading commodity in the Port of Los Angeles. By the 1970s, a new supertanker terminal could handle 35,000 barrels an hour, and the storage capacity at the port was 10 million barrels.
The Port of Los Angeles was the major import-export port for the west coast of the United States. There were a number of refineries, and every oil company had their terminal. The largest tanker in 1962 in the world was probably around 40,000 tons. Today, the largest tanker in the world is over 420,000 deadweight tons.
Since the 1890s, Los Angeles envisioned itself as a gateway to Asia. Those ambitions were realized in the 1960s and 70s. By then, Japan was the harbor's most important foreign trading partner. The United States exported scrap metal, and it returned from Japan as automobiles.
First Toyotas we received was 1956. They brought in 200 Toyopets. And my father, he was contacted by the Toyota people and asked if he could process them. And the cars in those days were coming in mixed on breakbulk ships and the first early roll-on, roll-off, combination car carriers, false decks, lots of damage, so lots of work to be done on the cars. And after a few months of testing them and trying to sell them, they decided the car wasn't ready for the U.S. market, and they shipped most of them back to Japan. But they contacted us again in the early 60s when they came in with the Corolla car. The European and the U.S. manufacturers told us that these cars will never succeed. And yet we opened up in San Pedro, and we all know now we were just at the tip of the iceberg, and this became a very successful venture for both the Port of Los Angeles and ourselves.
To much of America, the importance of Southern California was usually measured by images of sunny beaches and the glamour of the movies. But by the 1960s and 70s, and expanding trade with Asia, the U.S. economy was increasingly dependent on commerce through the Port of Los Angeles.
People began to understand its importance not just as a facility here in San Pedro for providing service to several million people sitting behind this port, but to millions and millions of people sitting across this country.
In the 1960s, the war in Vietnam brought a resurgence of military activities to the Port of Los Angeles, especially shipbuilding. With an $85 million contract, Todd Shipyards turned out 5 cargo passenger vessels and 16 guided missile frigates. But the shipbuilding boom didn't last, a victim of global competition, much of it from Asia. Asian competition also began to affect commercial fishing and canning, long an economic heart of the harbor.
As the seas began to fish out, as labor costs began to soar here, and cheaper labor developed and cheaper operations developed in other places, there began this tug on what would happen with the fish canneries here in San Pedro.
Like many U.S. corporations, even deeply rooted San Pedro companies like StarKist began to think globally.
First of all, we moved to Samoa because labor was cheaper there. We got some incentives down there. And then we moved to Puerto Rico. Had a big cannery in Puerto Rico, 4,000 people employed. And that was a good operation. And little by little, foreigners learned how to pack tuna. Thailand, Philippines.
In the 1950s, San Pedro had become the commercial fishing capital of the world. But with increasing globalization, the American economy was changing, and the job market in the Port of Los Angeles shifted dramatically.
It gutted the West Coast, and 15,000 cannery workers eventually lost their jobs. All the canneries closed down, and the boats that were left survived fishing on sardines and mackerel and squid here.
For Los Angeles at large, rapidly expanding container trade filled the economic gaps left by declining shipbuilding, fishing, and canning. But it was a challenge for people in San Pedro and Wilmington. They drew strength from their proud small-town traditions.
San Pedro was Mayberry. It was the Mayberry of the Andy Griffith Show. Was a small town, everyone knew everyone, people socialized with one another. It was a real tight-knit community. And for the most part, San Pedro in the 1960s and the 1970s, and for the majority of the 1980s was, and I don't mean to say this in a negative way, was stuck in the 1950s, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, San Pedro was able to enjoy the 1950s for 40 years, instead of just for a decade.
Like small American towns across the country in the 1950s and 60s, San Pedro and Wilmington rallied around local high school sports.
There was a very serious rivalry between San Pedro High School and Banning High School, to the point where several football games, there were knocked heads. It was the standard operating procedure for years and years and years.
In the early 1960s, I was the athletic director at San Pedro High School. It's really easy to get people to follow you when you're a winning team. But that particular year, we lost every game. But to show you the unique character and quality of the people in this town, when we had away games, we'd have 10 to 15 bus loads of people go to those games. One game we lost 53-0, if I remember correctly, in the Valley. And it was, at the end of the game, they stood, they cheered, they sang the school song. You would have thought we won the national championship.
In 1963, another source of local pride was a striking new suspension bridge, linking the mainland to Terminal Island. It was named in honor of Vincent Thomas, a local high school sports hero who became a state assemblyman. It took 20 years for Thomas to realize his dream.
His love was San Pedro. He loved the people of San Pedro, and he wanted to bring progress to San Pedro. Today, we've got a big working harbor, and thanks to Vince Thomas, because he decided to put the bridge there.
The completion of the Vincent Thomas Bridge meant that the venerable Terminal Island ferry was no longer needed. The past was fading fast. But a new addition to the harbor called Ports of Call promised to enrich San Pedro in other ways.
Ports of Call Village was kind of designed like a nautical seaport village. The first tenant in Ports of Call Village was Violet Parkhurst, the artist.
It was very picturesque and right on the channel. And loving the ocean and loving boats, I was happy when I moved here. Oh, it was so wonderful. It was just absolutely a mecca to be in. They had very fine boutiques, jewelry stores, and beautiful dress shops. People from the valley all over Los Angeles would come down.
There was an arcade for the kids to enjoy. And up at the top, the fish and chip stand, and they served burgers too, and the ice cream parlor were such a treat. And of a late spring and summer evening, we would often go there and get the fish and chips and throw French fries to the seagulls who'd catch them midair. And it was really fun and very special and a draw for all of Southern California.
Ports of Call added an environment for fun during the 1960s, but the harbor remained a no-nonsense economic engine of industry and commerce. On the West Coast, competition for Asian trade could be fierce.
I told the Nissan importing company president, we'll give you the best deal. Of course I said that. And he thought I was putting pressure on him. But I said that to everybody. Long Beach was saying the same thing. Oakland was saying the same thing. We were just trying to accommodate people who use our facilities. So we would have more jobs, more prosperity for Los Angeles.
To accommodate rapidly expanding trade, a new container port was built to serve a consortium of Japanese shipping lines. A 40-ton crane, the first and the largest in the country, was installed, capable of loading a container in 2.5 minutes. At the same time, a new multi-purpose terminal on a 3,500-foot-long wharf could handle 6 ships at a time and a bewildering mix of cargo.
A fun thing to do with a visitor when we would give a tour, we would be handling containers and pipe and crates and whatnot in the center of the terminal. And at the extreme eastern end, we'd be loading scrap metal into a big bulk carrier. And at the extreme west end of the terminal, we had an auto carrier discharging brand new automobiles.
As the pace of competition increased and the port continued to transform itself in response to the demands of the container age, a legacy of harbor activities decades before posed unexpected obstacles. By 1966, over 20 square miles of port land were sinking as much as 19 feet, including the 1928 Badger Avenue drawbridge.
The Badger Avenue Bridge was a timber edifice. And the bridge had subsidence 2 major times, which I always related to the pumping of oil by the Port of Long Beach. And so it had been raised in 2 lifts because of this subsidence.
Sinking bridges could block ship traffic, but subsidence caused by oil drilling also brought attention to other undesirable consequences of port development. America in the 60s was giving birth to a new concern with environmental quality.
In those days, the engineers really ran the port.
when everything was build, build, build. And when, the environmental laws came into place, and those of us who were working on environmental impact reports, which were a new thing, started using this word mitigation, everyone was like, what the heck is that? And really, the reaction we got is, hey, we don't mitigate. We create jobs. We don't have to mitigate. We're above that.
Pollution was quite extreme here. Before clean water regulations and strict environmental controls, ships would dump their oily water ballast right over the side. The same thing with sanitation. Their overboard discharges from their toilets, the washroom and all these, the galley, was discharged right into the harbor, flush it right over the side.
Bringing life back to the harbor environment would take time and result in more challenges along the way.
It was a slow, gradual change that went from having a harbor that was so polluted and you didn't have to worry about the timber piles in the back bay of the harbor because nothing lived back there, to a point when they started to clean up the water, and then they had to go on a massive program to wrap all the timber piles with plastic to keep them from being eaten up.
The return of wood-eating marine parasites was a mixed blessing, but proof that undersea life was returning to the Port of Los Angeles, and water quality continued to slowly improve. In the 1970s, the community of San Pedro was planning improvements of its own. A decade before, Los Angeles had leveled blocks of dilapidated downtown Victorian mansions to make way for a modern skyline. In 1971, Old Beacon Street got a makeover of its own. Legendary bars, businesses, and cafes were demolished, replaced with modern buildings, including needed public housing. But in the process, a portion of San Pedro's past was erased in the name of urban renewal. A farewell party was held, but not all San Pedrans believed it was something to celebrate. As a result, local activists became part of an historic preservation movement emerging across America. Like Beacon Street, the 1874 Point Fermin Lighthouse was considered obsolete and sentenced to face the wrecking ball. Historically minded San Pedrans fought back.
What I did, I went to the community. First thing, I went to E.K. Wood Lumber Company. And I said, we need some lumber for the lighthouse. Yes, free. Whatever, give John whatever he wants. So Bill ordered the lumber, we got it free. I went to San Pedro Glass and said, we need glass. He said, for the lighthouse, yes. Give John all the glass he wants, no charge. I couldn't believe it. I wasn't asking for it free. I was willing to pay for it. The whole town was the same way. So with that kind of an attitude, I said, what a wonderful town San Pedro is.
Saved, the lighthouse was added to the National Register of Historic Places. Soon, attention turned to faded 6th Street. In the years that followed, the arcade office building and the elegant 1930s Warner Grand Movie Theater would be saved and restored. As San Pedro and Wilmington celebrated and preserved their past, and the harbor continued to grow, changes of another kind were transforming America. During the 60s and 70s, a less proud historical legacy was being addressed. A new American civil rights movement was on the march, and the port was in its path.
We were familiar with the longshoremen and the clerks in the port and working in the ships and loading and unloading the ships, but we knew that we couldn't become a longshoreman because of sponsorship. It was all Caucasian, and of course you couldn't get a sponsor.
Many harbor jobs were passed from father to son through a closed system of sponsorships. Working with quiet persistence, San Pedro African Americans and other local activists challenged this unjust hiring system. It took a long time.
We had a lawsuit against the longshoremen. They ran 19 years. And a lot of the brothers kind of pushed my father to the forefront on this one. Said, John, you take this, John, you do this. And Dad was just fearless. He said, okay, let's do it. We're a small part of the population, and my mother and other members were really afraid that we would be persecuted for stopping this sponsorship, so we didn't talk about it much.
It took personal courage and dedication, but gradually conditions changed. Equal rights became the law in America and on the docks of the Port of Los Angeles.
40 years ago, I said you had no chance to come in longshoreman or clerk, until they, by the lawsuit we had. But now the way they do it, the way the hiring now is done to the casual haul, and everyone has an equal chance now. Now, I'm a supercargo. I supervise the loading and unloading of the ships, container ships, which is the highest paid clerk job you can have.
It wasn't long before women were also fighting for waterfront rights.
During World War II, women had done most of the functions on the waterfront because men were at war. Once men returned after World War II, the women went back to what they were doing before, which was at home or in school or nursing or whatever. And then it was over 30 years before I got a casual card. People were not happy. I was threatened a lot of times. I changed my phone number 6 times. And now the whole situation has changed. I knew the union was integrated and the workforce was integrated when the gearmen invited me to come to a baby shower for one of the longshore women that they were putting on. And I came to the gearman's room, and along with the centerfolds and all the turnbuckles and all the gear and the wires and the rope and all that stuff hanging around in there were also dozens of little baby outfits. The most macho of the macho, the gearmen, were observing this woman's motherhood. I thought that was a fabulous thing.
One of the objections to women on the docks were dangers on the job. Women proved they could do the work, but the dangers were real, even for men.
Probably the hardest is a winch driver. It's, you get up there and you drive the winch, you just realize how many people you got in your, their safety in your hands. So, the first thing is just calming your heart. The first time I drove, it was like, I don't like this feeling, because it's just, things can happen that are not your fault.
Heavy equipment is only one source of potential danger on the docks.
The explosion in San Pedro in December of 1976 was probably one of the biggest events that happened here in San Pedro because it affected a lot of people. It was a ship that it was just about done unloading at one of the berth 49 and at the Unocal dock. And somewhere or another, a spark ignited a lot of the fumes, and it blew the ship in half.
It wound up, there were 4 fireboats, 40 engine companies, and over 200 firefighters that fought that all night. It was quite a spectacular blaze. And Union Oil Company hired me initially to make an underwater inspection. They were particularly concerned about her bunker tanks because they had just taken on these 30,000 barrels of bunker C fuel. It was a scary proposition going in there. This was a day or two after. There was a lot of mangled and twisted steel. I didn't know how much of it was still hanging, ready to let go, working in through there. It was pretty scary. And environmentally, you can't put a cost on it. But as far as the cost of the operation of recovering this fuel oil, it was, they say, the most expensive environmental cleanup that's ever been done in the Port of Los Angeles, this underwater cleanup we did.
Improving the safety and efficiency of the Port of Los Angeles was an ongoing effort as the harbor launched another man-made makeover, entering a new era of dramatic expansion during the 1980s.
The history of the Port of Los Angeles is really the history of the dredging and landfilling process that started very early in this port to try and create the channels that we have today.
During my span or my career here at the port, we went through 3 major dredging projects, deepening the harbor originally from 25 feet, 35 feet, 45 feet, and now to 50 or 52 feet.
As it had many times before, dredging would transform the harbor, adding new land and changing its shape and capacity. During the container age, the future of the Port of Los Angeles depended on this more than ever.
That decision, personally, I think, is the most important strategic decision the port has made in its 100-year history.
A decision had been made, but putting that decision into action takes time and careful planning.
Nothing in the port happens very fast. You have a lot of environmental issues that you have to deal with, and then you also have the political issues of getting the funding out of the federal government and doing everything correctly in that process. It's a challenge.
One of the challenges was new environmental laws, but mitigation efforts, some miles away, offered innovative alternatives.
In order to get credits to build a facility in the Port of Los Angeles, you have to mitigate or restore an area in some region that has like environmental conditions. So there were communities that received enhanced developments in this state as a result of work that took place here at the port.
As a result of these new mitigation policies, the Port of Los Angeles helped enhance and preserve wetlands in places like Bataquitos Lagoon, 85 miles away. With environmental impacts addressed, massive dredging operations began in 1981, the first in the port in 53 years. The goal was to deepen the main channel to 45 feet and take mud from the harbor floor to create 190 acres for a new container operation, Pier 300. And later, with additional dredging, Pier 400, the largest proprietary container facility in the world. For the Port of Los Angeles, creating new land with dredging was an essential and innovative investment in the future.
I think that you can make a good case that the dredging of the channel probably was one of the first and largest applications of the principle of recycling. That's essentially what was happening. We were recycling the ocean floor.
In the early 80s, the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach were looking deep into the future, into the 21st century. Announced in 1984, their joint development strategy was called the 2020 Plan. Working with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the 2020 Plan was a massive multi-billion-dollar effort that would transform the scale and efficiency of both ports. But before work began, the ambitious proposal needed to be evaluated at a unique Vicksburg, Mississippi test site.
The Corps of Engineers has a model of the harbor, covers over an acre of land inside a shed. And they have all the data on tides, wave generations, and the capability to make these waves and water movements on the model. Any change in these features of the harbor have to be modeled at the Corps of Engineers, so you know how you're going to change the circulation in the harbor and how you're going to change whether your facility is going to have problems from surge or other natural occurrences in the ocean.
It was meticulous and complex work, and port engineers were challenged and excited.
At the port, as an engineer, you got to work on all types of engineering. There was paving, there were storm drains, there were sewers, there were container cranes, there were buildings, and you got a broad experience in working for a government agency. If you stay around at least 20 years, you'll see what you just designed and built being torn down to rebuild for the new technology and the new customers' needs. And there was about $750 million of construction contracts during that period of time. And I had engineers coming in on the weekends that weren't even charging their time. They were so excited about the fun. And this was probably the biggest building programs in the port since the 20s.
Another comparison with the 1920s was a thriving cruise business. During the 70s and 80s, television viewers around the world tuned in to follow the romantic adventures of the Love Boat, whose home port was San Pedro. While American TV viewers followed the shipboard romances on the Love Boat, Port of Los Angeles officials were courting a potentially powerful new trading partner, the People's Republic of China, as Asian business boomed. By 1989, Los Angeles and Long Beach topped New York, New Jersey as America's busiest port in terms of tonnage and cargo value. Even before the 21st century, the completion of the 2020 plan brought deeper channels, new container facilities, an intermodal container transfer facility connecting containers with trucks and trains, and the Alameda Corridor, a dedicated $1.2 billion rail link to downtown Los Angeles that closely followed the route of Phineas Banning's Little 1869 Railroad. Ships were essential to the container age, but getting goods in and out of a harbor also requires swift and efficient land-based transportation. The port's new intermodal container transfer facility was a response to this, providing a vital link between containers, trucks, and trains. Unlike many city ports, LA's harbor is 20 miles from downtown transportation centers. In between is a vast network of highways and heavy traffic. The 2020 plan addressed this potential bottleneck with a dedicated rail route called the Alameda Corridor. Bridges over a trench avoided road crossings, and trains could move directly to LA's main rail yards near the city center, and from there, across the country. The Intermodal Container Transfer Facility and the Alameda Corridor were part of an innovative new concept developed at the Port of Los Angeles during the 1980s. It was called the Land Bridge.
The land bridge was a theory that was brought about that trains would carry the containers between the West Coast and the East Coast. It was sort of wild to think about that here these containers were going on a crane, and bango, in a 2-day period, a ship unloading its full cargo. It's in New York.
Creating a seamless link between cranes, containers, trucks, and trains was not only faster, it was cheaper. The impact of the land bridge increased even more the importance of the Port of Los Angeles to the rest of America. By the year 2000, business and profits were at record levels. But in the harbor communities of San Pedro and Wilmington, growth and progress had their costs. Even with early mitigation efforts, the impact of industrial development and unhealthy environmental quality remained. And the people of LA's port towns had been paying the price. Dissatisfaction that had been building for decades increasingly found a voice.
I think the communities of Wilmington and San Pedro have always felt like they got shortchanged. They want to see money from this entity being poured into their community for a better quality of life, into their schools, into their streets, into their landscaping, programs that really help improve quality of life.
As far back as 1907 and the official founding of the Port of Los Angeles, there were those who saw the arranged union of Los Angeles, San Pedro, and Wilmington as a marriage of convenience. It proved to have pluses and minuses. But in the harbor communities, talk of a return to independence was often a common undercurrent. Finally, in 2002, after years of grumbling and threats, San Pedro called for a citywide vote to secede from Los Angeles and take the port with it. Secession would have major economic consequences. It was a heated debate on both sides, but ultimately the measure failed to pass.
I would have loved to see San Pedro, Wilmington area be a separate city too, but the city of LA needed the port. And actually the port was not owned by the city. The port was really owned by the state, and it was just managed by the city of Los Angeles, so the state never would agree to have this separated from the city of LA.
The city of Los Angeles got the message from disgruntled San Pedro and Wilmington. Elected officials began to listen, but the sometimes contentious conversation continues.
The port almost has its back towards the communities of San Pedro and Wilmington, and we need to turn it around so that both the port and the community can embrace each other.
In 2005, one sign of positive change was the first step in the creation of a dockside walking and biking path, stretching from the Vincent Thomas Bridge and the West Coast's #1 cruise ship center toward the old breakwater. With a welcomed nod to history, a restored red car trolley was returned to old tracks, and there were plans to revitalize faded ports of call. Wilmington, with perhaps even more complaints than San Pedro, received a new community center built on the site of Phineas Banning's 1860s dock facilities. The harbor pioneer would have been proud to see his town treated with new respect. Promising even greater improvements, in 2006, the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach announced a major commitment to reduce harmful fuel emissions by 50%. With this Clean Air Action Plan, the side-by-side ports became world leaders in the creation of a healthier harbor environment. Unresolved issues remained, but it was a bold beginning.
The concept of green port means that the port incorporates sustainability into its operations, its development plans. I mean, basically, we want to make sure that we're taking care of the environment, preserving it for future generations, to really aggressively try and reduce the level of emissions that we have out there, allow the port to grow, but really have emissions going down while growth is going up.
For decades, while the port expanded and rebuilt itself and began to improve its impact on the environment, the communities of San Pedro and Wilmington often struggled to stay the same, proud of their traditions and individuality.
It's one of the things that makes it really interesting. You don't go through Pedro. You come to Pedro, you leave Pedro, but you don't go through Pedro because there's nowhere to go. It's a dead end. You're a Pedro person. I mean, you even talk a different language. We call it Pedro, not San Pedro. We call it Pedro. You call it Cabrillo Beach, not Cabrillo Beach.
But by the 21st century, change continued to remake life in LA's harbor communities. Traditional jobs continued to disappear, replaced with new ones. Generations of ethnic communities remained, but newcomers were increasingly common. All the while, nearby malls lured customers from small downtown shops, and decades-old businesses passed away.
I've been in the baking business I was in for 49 years before I retired, and that's the only business I ever knew. The day that the last loaf of bread was going to be baked there, they managed to get me down to the bakery, and the superintendent down there, which I knew real well, my friend, he says, well, this is the last hurrah. He says, we're closing down today. They gave me the last loaf of bread that came off the line. And but I managed to get a few extra ones, too. So then when it was all over, we all went up to the Pacific Diner in San Pedro. We bought our own bread. He says, well, we're going to eat your breakfast, but you got to toast our bread because this is the last hurrah.
Since the 1970s, there had been many hopeful plans to revive downtown San Pedro, but results were often slow in coming. In 2006, things seemed to be looking up. A new deluxe 16-story residential tower rose with commanding views of port operations. Other high-rises were on the drawing boards. Where once fishermen, cannery workers, and longshoremen raised families in modest bungalows, new residents, many with little or no connection to the harbor workforce, were asked to pay as much as $1 million and more to live in San Pedro. Some old-timers looked up with optimism. Others were wary, concerned that their small town was inexorably slipping away.
When I think about what's happening with San Pedro and Wilmington, I have kind of mixed feelings. I love the new buildings going up, the new hotels, the condominiums with views of the water. I think change is inevitable, and the one thing I hope is that the people who move here will respect the history while creating their little niche in the community.
San Pedro is a very unique community, and when we care about the community, we care about each other.
Families stay. There are 5, 6 generations of families here. That doesn't happen today in many places.
You'd have your son, then he'd move next door to you, and have his kids, have your grandkids.
I think one of the things that is going on in this town, whether it's the waterfront development or the development in town in the redevelopment area, is the town has basically said, we want to grow, we want to improve, but we don't want to lose our identity.
If we don't embrace a new generation, we can't grow and prosper. We need to have a sustainable, growing business community. And we also must retain our sense of history if we are going to keep saying we have an historic downtown, we have an historic waterfront. We have to preserve buildings, we have to perpetuate them.
The future of San Pedro and the future of the port are definitely shared, the Wilmington area as well. The push-pull is, how does the port continue to be an economic engine and be a good neighbor?
Down the road, what we're going to see is this greener and greener terminals. We're going to see how to move cargo cleaner and more efficiently. And if the ports are to continue in this environment where they're surrounded by communities and sensitive areas, they're going to have to find cleaner ways and quicker ways to move freight and not cause pollution and congestion on the roads. And so there's always the evolution of change, and the port's going to have to, engineering's going to have to stay on the cutting edge to move cargo and move freight, to keep this country great and to move cargo across this region.
We are a business with an obligation to serve the needs of commerce, and that means that we have to grow and build stuff. I hope that people will understand that in order to really clean up, we have to have new projects where we have the leverage to force people to clean up. And we have to persuade the business community that we're serious about wanting their business, and that's a challenge also.
In 2008, the Port of Los Angeles was America's #1 container complex. Joined with the Port of Long Beach, the twin facilities ranked 4th in the world. The United States had become an import economy, much of it from Asia, and the containers passing through the port were filled with evidence. Furniture, apparel, auto parts and tires, toys and computers topped the import list, mostly from China, Japan, and Taiwan. The Port of Los Angeles encompassed 7,500 acres, with 43 miles of waterfront, 27 cargo terminals, and 270 cranes. Harbor activities supported more than 259,000 regional jobs, with $8.4 billion in annual wages and tax revenues. The port was not only big, its operations were vital to the U.S. economy. Nearly 40% of American trade passed through San Pedro and its neighboring harbor at Long Beach. After the East Coast terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, security in the Port of Los Angeles became more important than ever. To a great extent, America's economy depended on it. To explore the modern Port of Los Angeles can be a cruise through the past and present, adding a sense of what's to come.
There was a history here. When we started our boat business, there were still the old timber wharfs and the old warehouses, and there were the smaller ships that sat at the dock for weeks at a time while the longshoremen unloaded them using ropes and booms to load the cargo. Things have migrated to these large megaships where they're only in port a day or two at a time, and when we cruise by there might be 4 crane operators moving cargo every 30 or 40 seconds. And there's a lot more diverse cargo now because we're seeing a lot of these big ships are coming from China. The other thing that's really changed in the port is the water's so clean. Now we have the cleanest harbor in the world. The water is so clear, you'll see Garibaldi, which is a goldfish-like fish that's almost a foot long. We also have so many sea lions now, and it's not even an unusual day when you have a pot of porpoise swimming in the outer part of the harbor. It's been cleaned up so much.
After hundreds of years, virtually nothing remains of the modest mudflats surrounded by Native American villages and glimpsed by Spanish explorer Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo in 1542. The grand ranchos of Southern California's Mexican period have been overbuilt with American housing and freeways, but a few old adobes remain. The cliffs that author and novice seaman Richard Henry Dana cursed as he unloaded hides in the 1830s still stand. But harbor cargo has increased and diversified beyond anyone's 19th century imagination. The elegant 1860s mansion built by harbor pioneer Phineas Banning is still there, a monument to his vision and hard work. Today, modern trains follow the route he pioneered in 1869 with LA's first 2 locomotives. Nearby is the Civil War-era Camp Drum Barracks, preserving the beginnings of the port's military history. The great federal breakwater, won through the contentious harbor fight of the 1890s, still shields San Pedro Harbor, as it has since the birth of the Port of Los Angeles in 1907. And the Angel's Gate Light continues to welcome arriving ships. The busy docks of the 1920s have been replaced by vast container facilities, but the glamorous days of the old Los Angeles Steamship Company's cruises to Hawaii have developed an astonishing new scale with enormous seagoing resort hotels. Dock workers operate sophisticated cranes and computer-controlled management systems, but their jobs and working conditions are a legacy of the hard-fought labor battles of the 1930s. World War II is remembered by a restored cargo ship, the Lane Victory, a floating museum celebrating San Pedro's once thriving shipbuilding industry. The Japanese-American community on Terminal Island is gone, commemorated with a proud monument. Also gone, the great canning factories and hundreds of fishing boats that made Los Angeles the commercial fishing capital of the world. But memories remain in a maritime museum, housed in the old ferry building, and a small fishing fleet keeps more than a century of tradition alive. It started during the 1930s with simple exhibits in mayonnaise jars. But today, the Cabrillo Marine Aquarium is a world-class institution, continuing to serve generations of school kids and their families. The communities of San Pedro and Wilmington are still proud of their port town past, but changes are coming, including new people with new interests and attitudes. As for the Port of Los Angeles, as it celebrated its 100th anniversary, it looked back to a past driven by ambition, vision, and shrewd politics, capitalized with billions of dollars and secured by geographical good luck. But with a rapidly accelerating and ever-shifting worldwide marketplace, the challenges of growth and competition were greater than ever. And the port's challenges are America's challenges. San Pedro and Wilmington are small towns with big stories to tell.
The thing about Pedro, fabulous history in almost every area. I mean, athletic history, movie history, history, nautical history, military history. Pedro is a very interesting place.
What I love about San Pedro is the ocean. You can watch the freighters go out, you can watch sailboats, you can watch fishing boats. Then you come over here and look, and some people complain about the cranes being ugly. I think they're beautiful because they mean work for the harbor, and I do think they're beautiful. And when I ride over the bridge, I get very nostalgic. I can almost come to tears. I look at the harbor and I think, look how this has grown. Just look at all the people that are working here. How wonderful.
We're America's port. You know about Ellis Island, that's where the people came through. Well, LA's where the goods come through.
In many ways, the history of the Port of Los Angeles reflects the history of the United States during the past 100 years. The movement of population and economic power to the west, the rise of Asian influence and the global marketplace, the evolution of our nation's cultural diversity, and the struggle to balance industrial growth with a healthy environment. The past is found in the story of the Port of Los Angeles, and so is a sense of America's future.
We are making history today by the things that we're doing today. The far-reaching look to technology, the look at how we're going to generate our own power in the port, the look at how we're going to move containers on some clean system that doesn't have any impact on the community. The things we're doing today, people 100 years in the future will look back on and say, wow, you know, those people were really, you know, they made history back then. And so I think we're making history today.